The video lasts about as long as it takes to draw one slow breath, and the man who recorded it has watched it more times than he can count. He told me it never gets easier. The hard part, he said, is not the shape that crosses in front of the headlights. It is the half second before the shape arrives when everything on the screen still looks like an ordinary night. A gravel forest road. The dark wall of timber standing close on both sides. A little frost shining on the weeds along the shoulder. And then the road is not empty anymore, and your mind is handed something it has no folder for, and it spends that last half second trying to force the shape into a man, or into a bear, or into a smear on the lens, and failing at all three. The recording came off a camera mounted inside the cab of a United States Forest Service law enforcement truck on a forest road in the Allegheny National Forest in the northwestern corner of Pennsylvania. As far as I have been able to confirm, it is one of the only pieces of dogman footage ever captured by a commissioned law enforcement officer in the middle of a routine night shift. The officer who recorded it did everything by the book. He wrote a report. He logged the video into evidence. And then the federal record system did something to that report that he would not understand for another 13 years. When he finally did understand it, he pulled 20 years of Forest Service incident files covering 9 states. And what he found inside them is the reason this footage matters and the reason we are telling this story tonight. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe and let us know down in the comments where you are watching from. Thank you. The officer asked that we not use his name. That was not a casual request, and by the time you understand what his own agency's records did with his report, and what he came to believe those records had quietly been doing for the better part of 2 decades, you will understand why a man with a clean federal career and a pension he depends on wants his name kept a long way from the word dogman. We will call him Roy. The name is the only thing in this account that has been changed. The forest is real. The agency is real. The river and the reservoir and the counties and the record system and the history are all real, and all of it can be checked. Only the man is covered, because the man still lives within an hour of that forest, still has family there, and still runs into people he worked beside for 30 years at the hardware store and the diner and the funerals that come more often now than they used to. Roy gave the better part of 3 decades to the United States Forest Service. He grew up in the hill country of northwestern Pennsylvania, in the broken ground between the old oil towns and the river, in a family where the men had worked the woods one way or another for as far back as anybody kept track. His grandfather cut timber. His father cut timber and then put in years in the gas fields. Roy started out the same way on the labor end of the Forest Service, marking timber and clearing trail. And within a few years, he moved into the side of the agency that almost nobody thinks about when they picture a national forest. He became a commissioned law enforcement officer. People hear the words forest ranger and they picture somebody pointing out wildflowers to school children. Forest Service law enforcement is not that job. Roy carried a badge and a sidearm for the federal government. He patrolled better than 500,000 acres of public land alone in a 4-wheel drive pickup, most of his hours falling between dusk and dawn, on a road network that runs to hundreds of miles of gravel, dirt, and grown-over logging grade. He worked timber theft and firewood theft. He worked the ginseng diggers who slip into the hollows every September to pull a root that sells by the dried pound. He worked marijuana grows, the kind set up a long walk off any road by people who did not want to be found and did not always leave politely when they were found. He worked stolen cars, pushed down embankments, illegal dump sites, vandalism at the campgrounds, hunters who shot from the road or over their limit, and missing persons whenever a hiker or an elk hunter failed to come out of the woods when they were due. He qualified with his firearms every year, the way every commissioned officer does. He was trained to read sign, to work a scene, to hold a situation together alone with his nearest backup 40 minutes of bad road away. He was good at the work. The people above him trusted his eyes. When Roy wrote in a report that a track belonged to a particular animal, or that a vehicle had been parked at a site for a particular number of days, nobody upstairs argued with him because Roy did not reach. He told you what was in front of him and nothing past it. By every account I gathered, he was the kind of officer the public never has any reason to think about, and in that line of work, that is the highest thing anyone can say about you. I want to give you the forest itself, because the place is not scenery in this story. It is part of the machinery of it. The Allegheny National Forest covers a little over 500,000 acres across 4 counties: Warren, McKean, Elk, and Forest, in the top corner of Pennsylvania. It is the only national forest the state has. It was set aside in 1923, and it was set aside because by then there was almost nothing left to set aside. The timber companies had run through the Allegheny Plateau like a fire. They cut the white pine and the hemlock and the big hardwoods down to stumps and slash and moved on, and what they left was bad enough that the people of that era had a name for it. They called it the Allegheny brush pile. The forest you can drive through today, the dense second growth of black cherry and beech and maple and hemlock that closes over the roads by July, all of that grew back inside a single human lifetime, on top of ground that had been scraped down to the dirt, which means the forest is younger than it looks and emptier than it looks. It rolls. Glacial ridges and steep little stream valleys laced together by creeks with names like Tionesta and Kinzua and Millstone, all of it draining toward the Allegheny River, which the federal government dammed in the 1960s to make the Allegheny Reservoir. There are corners of it that almost nobody walks into from one year to the next. There is a stand near Sheffield, the Tionesta tract, that the loggers somehow passed over. A few thousand acres of true old-growth beech and hemlock that were standing timber before the United States was a country. And it is one of the largest pieces of old forest left anywhere in the northeastern states. Get off the paved roads, off Route 666, off the numbered forest roads, off the old grades, and you can put a few miles of dark between yourself and the next human being faster than people from the cities ever believe. That is the country Roy patrolled by himself after midnight for the better part of 30 years. He liked it. That matters. This is not the story of a nervous man. Roy grew up in those woods, and he chose a career that kept him in them, and he raised his family at the edge of them. He and his wife, who we will call Nancy, bought a place on a few acres outside one of the small towns on the forest boundary and put 2 children through the local schools from there. Roy hunted. He hunted deer and turkey and bear, the way 3/4 of the men in that part of Pennsylvania do, and he was the kind of hunter who would rather be out in the cold not seeing anything than be home warm. On his days off, he walked. He knew the forest the way you know a house you have lived in your whole life, by feel in the dark, without thinking. He could tell you which hollows held water in a dry August and which side roads washed out in a hard spring and which ridges the deer used when the wind came out of the west. The forest was not a place Roy was afraid of. It was the place Roy was most himself. You need to hold on to that, because the man who finished his career was not able to feel that way anymore. And the distance between those 2 versions of him is the true subject of this whole account. There is one more person I need to put in front of you before the night this story turns on, and that is the officer who trained Roy when he first crossed over to the law enforcement side. We will call him Merle. Merle was an old hand, close to 30 years in, riding out the last stretch before his retirement, and the agency paired him with Roy for Roy's first months carrying a badge. Merle taught him the practical things: how to run a road at night without burning out your own eyes, how to talk to a man with a rifle in his hands and a buck he should not have shot at his feet, how to write a report that would still make sense to a stranger 5 years later. And one night, the two of them parked on a grade above the Tionesta drainage. Merle told Roy something that Roy did not think about again for a very long time. He told him not to make a habit of sitting too long in that particular country with the engine shut off after midnight. Roy assumed it was advice about staying awake on a long shift, and he thanked him for it, and he forgot it. He would remember it eventually, word for word, and when he did, it would land very differently than Merle had let on. But that was years away. In the fall of 2004, Merle was retired and gone, and Roy was a settled, capable mid-career federal officer with nothing on his mind heavier than the upcoming rifle season, and the trouble in the Tionesta country started the way these things almost always start, with something small and easy to explain away. It started with the quiet. In October of that year, Roy began to notice that one section of his patrol area had gone wrong in a way he could not put his finger on. It was a block of forest on the Tionesta side, a few square miles of mixed timber and stream bottom that he ran through most shifts. The Allegheny is not a quiet forest. It is loud with life. Deer move through it in numbers that astonish out-of-state hunters. Black bears are thick, especially in the fall, fattening on beech nuts and whatever they can turn over. Coyotes call across the ridgelines. Owls work the dark. Even at 2 in the morning, a forest like that has a texture of sound to it, and a man who has spent 30 years listening to it the way Roy had does not hear that texture so much as feel its absence. And in that one block that October, it was absent. He would shut the truck off to listen the way he had 100 times, and there would be nothing. No deer shifting in the laurel, no mice in the leaf litter. Wind in the high limbs and the tick of his own cooling engine, and past that, a silence that did not belong in October in Pennsylvania. He mentioned it to nobody because there was nothing to mention. A quiet patch of woods is not a crime. But he started paying attention the way the job had trained him to, and the small things began to add up. He found a deer kill that did not read right. A mature doe, dead maybe a day, dragged a good distance off a game trail and left at the base of a hemlock. The neck was broken, the throat had been opened, and the kill was clean, almost tidy, with very little of the scatter and mess that a coyote pack leaves or that a bear leaves when a bear bothers with a deer at all. And the carcass had barely been fed on. Something had killed that doe efficiently, moved it deliberately, and left most of the meat. That is not how predators in that forest behave. Predators in that forest are hungry. Roy stood over that carcass for a while, and then he did the thing his training told him to do, which was to note it, photograph it, and move on without building a story around it. A week or so later, he found tracks. They were in the soft mud of a skid trail after a rain, and they were canine. 4 toes and claw marks, the shape unmistakable. But the size was wrong and the spacing was worse. A big coyote in Pennsylvania leaves a track maybe 2.5 inches long. A track that size you do not look at twice. These ran better than 5 inches, which is past anything a coyote produces and well past any wolf the state has on its books, and Pennsylvania does not have a wolf population to begin with. The eastern wolf was gone from that country more than 100 years ago. Roy crouched over those prints in the mud for a long time, and what held him there was not the size. It was the stride. The distance between one print and the next was far longer than a 4-footed animal of any size walks. He measured it twice with the tape from his kit because he did not trust the first number. He told himself it was 2 animals, one stepping into the other's tracks. But the trail did not support that. It ran on, single file even, the gait of one thing covering ground, and the pattern of it was not the pattern of something walking on 4 legs. Roy is a careful man, and I am going to be careful describing what came next. Because this is the night the whole story stands on, and he has gone over it with me slowly and more than once. And I want to give it to you the way he gave it to me. The way he reviewed it afterward on a screen, alone, more times than was good for him. It was a weeknight in the back half of October. Cold, clear, no moon worth mentioning. Roy was running the Tianesta block on the second loop of his shift, sometime after 1 in the morning on a numbered forest road. Gravel, single lane, timber crowding both shoulders. His headlights were on, his small overhead light bar was dark, and the camera in the cab, the one mounted up by the mirror that recorded the road ahead through the windshield, was running. The way it ran every shift, because Roy never thought about it any more than you think about your own seatbelt. He came around a long bend, and there was something standing in the road. His first read in the first instant was a man. The thing was upright on 2 legs, and that is the only category the human eye has for an upright shape at distance in the dark. So for a moment Roy's mind handed him a man, and he started to do the things you do for a person on a forest road at 1 in the morning, which is to slow down and get ready to find out who they are and what they are doing out there. He came off the gas. The truck slowed. The gap closed and the headlights climbed up the shape and the reed fell apart. It was too tall. That was the first thing that would not fit. Roy had stopped hundreds of people on those roads, and he had a trained, automatic sense of scale, and this stood well above what a tall man stands. The proportions were the second thing. The shoulders were too wide and set too heavy for the waist below them. The arms were too long and they hung wrong, down past where a man's hands would fall. And the head was the thing that ended any argument. It was not a man's head. It carried forward into a muzzle, a long one, and the ears stood up off the top of the skull, set high and pointed, and they turned. Roy watched them turn toward the sound of his truck, independent of the rest of the head, the way a dog's ears track a noise, and that small movement was somehow worse than all the size because it was alive and it was paying attention. He stopped the truck. He says he does not remember deciding to stop it. The truck simply was stopped, in the road, maybe 25 yards from the shape. Headlights full on it, engine running, and the camera up by the mirror running too, recording all of it through the glass. The thing did not run. Roy told me that is the part he keeps coming back to even now, more than the muzzle, more than the size. Every animal in that forest runs from a vehicle at night. Deer run. Bear run for all their bulk. Coyotes are gone before your light finds them. Things that live in a hunted forest have a hard-wired understanding of headlights and engines, and the understanding is leave. This did not leave. It stood square in the road in the full throw of his high beams, and it turned the rest of the way to face the truck, and it looked at him. The eyes took the light and threw it back. Not white, the way a deer's eyes shine. A dull amber, low and steady, set forward on that long skull the way the eyes of a hunting animal are set forward, the eyes of something built to fix on a thing and close on it. Roy sat behind the wheel of a federal truck with a sidearm on his hip and a radio in reach, and he told me plainly that for the length of that look he was the most afraid he has been in his life, in or out of uniform, and that the fear was not really about size or teeth. It was that the thing in his headlights was looking back at him with what he could only call attention. Not the blank animal stare of a deer caught in a light. Assessment. He said it was being measured. He said the look had weight to it, the specific weight of being studied by something that was deciding about him. And then the thing in the road did the thing that Roy has never been able to set down. It took one step toward the truck. One. A single deliberate step that closed a few feet of the gap, and then it stood again, and it held him there. Roy had spent his whole career stepping out into roads to stop vehicles. He knew exactly what that one step was because it was his own move. The move an officer makes to bring a car to a halt and hold it. The thing in the road had conducted a stop. It had put itself in his path, faced him down, closed the distance just enough to make its authority plain. And then it had held him in place while it took its time looking at him. On its road, Roy did not feel like a man who had come across an animal. He felt like a man who had been pulled over. He does not know how long it lasted. He thinks 10 or 15 seconds, and he is honest enough to say that under that kind of fear, a person is a poor judge of time. What ended it was the thing's own choice. It turned without hurry, the way you turn from something you have finished with, and it walked off the road into the timber on the right-hand side. 2 steps on 2 legs, upright, that long, smooth, ground-covering stride, and then, at the edge of the light, it folded down onto all 4 limbs in a single motion that Roy said was the most unnatural thing in the whole encounter. Because there was nothing clumsy in it, no transition, no awkward drop. It simply went from a thing that walked like a man to a thing that ran like a wolf, and it was gone. And the timber took it, and the road was empty, and the camera up by the mirror was still running. Roy did not move for a while. When he did, the first thing he noticed was his own hands. They were shaking hard enough that he had trouble with the radio. And he found that he did not want to key it anyway because he did not have words yet that would not end his career inside 1 sentence. He drove. He did not finish the loop. He took the fastest line out of that block of forest that he knew. And he told me he caught himself doing 35 miles an hour on gravel he would have written somebody else up for taking at 20, checking his mirrors the whole way, and that his mouth had gone completely dry and stayed that way until past dawn. He sat in the truck outside the work center until the sky started to gray, and then Roy did what Roy always did, the thing his whole professional life was built on. He wrote it down. This is the part of the story where it stops being only an encounter and starts being something larger, and I want to slow down here because everything that follows turns on a piece of government paperwork. Roy wrote an incident report. He had a camera recording that he believed showed exactly what he had seen, and he had 30 years of credibility, and he had an absolute professional obligation to document an unusual event in his patrol area. So he documented it. He did not write the word dogman. He had never heard the word in his life at that point and would not hear it for years. He wrote it the way he was trained to write everything, in plain, flat, careful language. He described an animal. He described an upright canine animal of unusual size, gave its estimated height and build, described the bipedal posture, the transition to 4 legs, the eye shine, the behavior in the road. He noted the location and the time and the conditions. He noted that he had video. He logged the video into evidence. He did the job correctly, completely, the way he had done it 10,000 times. And then he handed it up the chain, and the system took it, and the system did what the system does. Within a few days, the report came back down to him. Not rejected. Reports do not really get rejected. It came back recoded. Every incident in the Forest Service law enforcement system gets a category, a classification, so the agency can sort and count and track what is happening on its land. Timber theft has a category, trespass has a category, a vehicle in a ditch has a category. There is no category in that system for an upright canine animal that conducts a traffic stop on a federal officer. There is no box for it. There never has been. And a report that does not have a valid category cannot be closed, and an open, uncategorized report is a small, ugly problem sitting on a supervisor's desk. So a supervisor had solved the small, ugly problem the only way the system allowed it to be solved. The narrative Roy had written, his careful, flat description, was still in there, untouched, in the free text field where an officer types what happened. But the category at the top of the report had been changed. It had been changed to nuisance wildlife. Black bear. Roy told me he looked at that for a long time. He understood immediately what had happened and why, and he understood that there was no version of pushing back on it that did not end with him being the officer who would not let go of the dogman report. And he had a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage and a pension he was a long way from vesting fully. So he did the thing that nearly every witness in this entire field eventually does. He let it go. He told himself the category did not matter as long as the narrative was preserved. He told himself the video was logged and the video was the truth and the video would always be there. He went back to work. And here is the thing I most need you to sit with before we go on, because it is the quiet engine of this entire story. Nobody did anything wrong. There was no cover-up. There was no order from on high. A supervisor with a stack of work and a software system that would not let him close a file had picked the nearest available box and moved on, exactly as the system was designed to make him do. And in doing that one small reasonable thing, he had taken the single most extraordinary piece of evidence ever recorded in that forest and filed it forever, under bear. If you have spent time in the Allegheny on the Tianesta side, in the country off Route 666 or back along the forest roads that run down toward the reservoir, you know the particular kind of dark I have been describing, the way that forest closes in once you're off the pavement and the way the quiet can sit on you. I would like to hear from you. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had something happen out in that forest on those roads that you were never able to set straight in your own mind, because the records I am about to walk you through suggest that the country between Warren and Marionville has held a great deal more of this than anyone has ever been allowed to count. For 13 years, Roy carried the encounter the way you carry an old injury. It was always there and he mostly did not look at it. He stayed in the forest. He had to. It was his job. But he changed how he worked it. He stopped shutting the engine off to listen in the Tianesta block. He ran his loops and kept moving. He never saw the thing again, though 2 or 3 times over those years he found tracks that put a cold feeling in him. And once, on a winter night, he heard something from a long way off across a frozen drainage. A low rising and falling call with a structure to it that did not match any coyote he had heard in 30 years of listening to coyotes. And he rolled up his window and drove and did not write that one down at all. He had learned that lesson. He had learned what the system did with that kind of truth. The thing that finally cracked the story open was not another encounter. It was a desk job. Late in his career, with his knees and his back telling him plainly that the road work had a limited number of years left in it, Roy was pulled off regular patrol and brought in on a project. The Forest Service, like every law enforcement body in the country, was in the middle of dragging its records into the modern era. For years, the agency's law enforcement reports had lived in an older system, and that older data now had to be cleaned up, standardized, and migrated so it would line up with the national crime reporting standard that federal and state agencies were all moving onto. It was slow, unglamorous work, and somebody had decided that an experienced officer who knew what the reports actually meant in the real world would be useful on the team doing it. So for the last stretch of his career, Roy sat at a computer, and his job was to go through old law enforcement incident files region-wide and make sure each one was complete and correctly classified before it was moved into the new system. Region-wide. I need you to understand the scale of what that put in front of him. The Forest Service divides the country into 9 regions. Roy's forest sits in the eastern region, which is run out of an office in Milwaukee and which covers on its own 20 states. From Maine across to Missouri, the whole sweep of the northern hardwood and Great Lakes forest country. Roy was not looking at his own forest's files anymore. He was looking at 2 decades of law enforcement incident reports from national forest land across 20 states. And he was one of the very few people who would ever look at them this way, because he was not querying the database the way the database was meant to be queried. He was not pulling counts by category. He was a careful old officer doing a careful job, and that meant he was opening files one at a time and actually reading them. He was reading the narratives. He was reading the free text fields where the officer types what happened, the fields that, in the ordinary running of that system, almost nobody ever reads. He found his own report first. He told me he had half been looking for it the way you press on a bad tooth. He pulled up his 2004 incident, and there was his own flat, careful narrative, every word of it still intact 13 years on, describing the thing in the road. And there at the top, the category: nuisance wildlife, black bear. Seeing it again after all those years with the eyes of a man whose whole job now was the integrity of these records did something to Roy. He stopped thinking of it as the small, reasonable mistake he had made his peace with. He started thinking of it as a question. If it happened to mine, he thought, how many times has it happened to somebody else's? There was one more thing Roy checked that first day, with his own file open in front of him. He went looking in the evidence log for the video, the recording from the camera up by the mirror, the thing he had logged so carefully in 2004. The proof he had told himself for 13 years would always be there. It was not there. He told me it took him a while to even find the anger because once again there was no one to aim it at. Physical and digital evidence from closed cases is held on a retention schedule, a set number of years tied to the seriousness of the case, and then it is routinely and lawfully destroyed to make room for the new. Roy's case had been closed as a nuisance bear complaint. A nuisance bear complaint is about as minor as a file gets, and the retention clock on a file that minor is short. It had run out years before. The video had been disposed of on schedule by no one in particular, exactly as the regulations required. The only reason that footage exists anywhere in the world tonight, the only reason you saw what you saw at the start of this, is that Roy, back in 2004, uneasy in a way he could not have put into words, had quietly made himself a private copy and carried it home. The agency's copy is gone. It was not destroyed in secrecy, and it was not destroyed in malice. It was destroyed by a calendar. So he started looking, on his own time, mostly around the edges of the assigned work. He could not search for what he wanted directly, because the whole problem was that the thing he was looking for had no category to search by. There was no query that returned dogman. So he searched the only place the truth could possibly have survived, which was the language itself. He began running text searches across 2 decades of narrative fields, 20 states of them for the words an officer would actually reach for if an officer were trying to describe this without a word for it and without ending his career. Upright, bipedal, canine, walked on 2 legs, man-like, dog-headed, eyes shine, large unknown animal. He read everything those searches returned. It took him months. It was during those months that Roy first heard the word for what he had been looking at all along. He had begun reading outside the files by then, in the evenings, the way an investigator reads around the edges of a case, and he found the people who quietly study this. The researchers and the witnesses and the long private record they have kept among themselves for decades. He found the word dogman. He told me he did not love the word. It sounded to a man of his temperament a little too much like a story told to scare children, and what he had faced on that road and what he was now reading in 20 years of federal paperwork did not feel like a story told to scare children. It felt like wildlife biology that the wildlife biologists were never going to be permitted to do. But the word dogman was the word the witnesses themselves had arrived at independently, across all those years and all those states, and the accounts that came attached to it matched his own down to the smallest detail of posture and behavior. So Roy used it, carefully, the way you use a tool you did not make and do not entirely trust. What he found is the reason this video exists. Across the 9 most heavily forested states in that 20-state region, spread over the years from 1998 through 2019. Roy assembled a stack of incident reports that, read together, told one single coherent story. He stopped counting carefully somewhere past 200. They were not identical, the way fabrications are identical. They were consistent the way truth is consistent, varied in their details and their wording, written by men and women who plainly had no idea the others existed. A backcountry ranger in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan describing an upright animal pacing her truck. A law enforcement officer in the West Virginia mountains documenting a tall, dog-headed figure standing over a deer carcass. A trail crew foreman in the Minnesota North Country who wrote that the same upright shape had watched his men work through an afternoon and then paced them at a distance, all the way back to their vehicles at the close of the day. An officer in the Missouri Ozarks who recorded in the careful understatement of a man choosing every word that he had encountered a large mammal he was unable to classify and had elected not to pursue it. Reports out of the National Forest land in Wisconsin, in the Pennsylvania Highlands, in Ohio, in Indiana, in Vermont. 2 decades, 9 states, officers and biologists and trail crew, people whose entire professional worth rested on being reliable witnesses, all of them describing, in their own plain words, the same animal Roy had faced down on a gravel road in October of 2004. Roy read them in sequence, and reading them that way let him see the shape of the thing. The encounters clustered. They clustered along rivers and reservoir shorelines and the high ridge lines near the edges of designated wilderness, in exactly the kind of country where human traffic thins down to almost nothing. And they clustered in the fall. More of these reports were written in October and November than in all the other months of the year put together, the same weeks when the woods fill with hunters, the same weeks when a thing that wanted humans moved out of its country would have the most reason in the world to make itself known. And every single one of those reports carried a category at the top that buried it. Nuisance wildlife, black bear, coyote, unknown animal, vandalism. Some were marked unfounded, the code for a report that investigation could not substantiate. A great many were marked simply undetermined. Not one of those reports was classified as anything a person could ever find by looking. The narratives, the actual accounts, sat preserved and perfect underneath the way Roy's had. But the categories formed a smooth, unbroken, decades-long surface of bears and coyotes and nothing to see here. And the categories were the only part of the record that the agency, or the public, or a researcher, or a reporter would ever query, read, or count. Roy had found the place where this phenomenon goes to disappear. It does not get destroyed, it gets reclassified. And before I show you how that machine actually works and what it cost the man who found it, I need to take you a long way back, because the most unsettling thing Roy came to understand is that the pattern in those federal files is not the start of anything. It is the most recent 2 decades of something a great deal older. The forest Roy patrolled did not begin as the Allegheny National Forest. For thousands of years before there was a Forest Service or a Pennsylvania or a United States, that plateau and the river that drains it were Seneca country. The Seneca, the Onondaga, the western nation of the Haudenosaunee, the people the rest of the world later called the Iroquois, held the upper Allegheny watershed, and they held it long and deeply. And there is a piece of that history that I think every person watching this needs to know, because it sits at the literal bottom of the reservoir Roy could see from the ridgelines on his patrol. In 1794, the United States, a young country still, signed the Treaty of Canandaigua with the Haudenosaunee. The federal government under Washington put its name to a promise that certain lands would remain in Seneca hands, secure, undisturbed. It is one of the oldest treaties the United States ever signed, and it has never been formally repealed. It is still on paper the law, and in the 1960s the federal government built the Kinzua Dam across the Allegheny. and the reservoir that backed up behind it flooded that treaty land. It drowned the corn planter tract, the ground granted to the Seneca leader corn planter and held by his descendants for more than a century and a half. It put a people's homes, their fields, and their graves under water, and it scattered the families who lived there. The promise of 1794 was checkable. It was specific, it was signed, and it was broken with a wall of concrete, and a folk song was written about the broken faith of it that people still sing. I lay that history alongside Roy's stack of files on purpose because the parallel is the point and Roy saw it before I did. This is a landscape where the official record and the truth have a long documented habit of failing to match. Where a promise can be filed, archived, and still standing, and the water can close over the real thing anyway. When I contacted the Historic Preservation Office of the Seneca Nation to ask carefully whether their traditions included any account of a being that might bear on these reports, the response I received was courteous, and it was final. They do not discuss certain traditional knowledge with outsiders, and they were not going to discuss it with me. They did not laugh at the question. They did not deny anything. They simply drew a line, the way Roy's old training officer Merle had drawn a line years before with a single sentence on a dark grade above the Tionesta. Some things are known. They are not handed to strangers. And that careful non-denial in my experience of this work tends to mean a great deal more than a flat no ever would. What Roy was looking at in those 9 states was not new, and it was not his alone to discover. It connects to a record that the people who study this phenomenon have been assembling for a very long time. Reports of an upright, dog-headed animal go back in the Great Lakes country well past living memory. There is an account from Wexford County, Michigan from 1887 of 2 lumberjacks who came on a creature with the body of a man and the head of a dog. In 1987, a radio host named Steve Cook at a station in Traverse City, Michigan wrote and aired a song about a Michigan dogman as an April Fool's joke, an invention, something he made up out of nothing. And then the calls started, and they did not stop, and they were not jokes. People who had told no one came forward with accounts, some of them decades old, of exactly the animal Cook thought he had invented. A few years after that, a Wisconsin journalist named Linda Godfrey began reporting on sightings of an upright canine creature near Elkhorn, in the farm country of Walworth County, the case that became known as the Beast of Bray Road. Godfrey spent the next 3 decades of her life gathering these accounts, hundreds of them across the Great Lakes and far beyond. And the consistency she documented is the single hardest thing in this entire subject to wave away. The size, the dark coat, the forward-set shining eyes, the pointed upright ears on a long muzzled head, the shift from 2 legs to 4, the territorial behavior, the strange, deliberate watching restraint. Godfrey was working from the accounts of ordinary frightened people. Roy, without ever intending to, had found the same animal, with the same behavior written down in the careful hand of federal law enforcement and then hidden 200 times over by nothing more sinister than a list of approved categories. So how does that actually happen? How do you bury 2 decades of evidence across 9 states without a single person ever deciding to bury it? I have come to believe this is the most important question in the whole story, more important than the creature because the machine Roy uncovered is real. It is ordinary, and it is almost certainly still running tonight. Let me walk you through it the way he walked me through it, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and you will start to wonder what else it has swallowed. It begins with the report itself. An officer like Roy sees something. The officer is obligated to document it, and the officer documents it honestly in the narrative field in plain language. So far, the system has worked. The truth is now written down. But the report is not finished because every report in that system must be assigned a category before it can be closed. and the list of categories is finite, and it was written by people sitting in an office who were thinking about timber theft and car break-ins and lost hikers. The list is a list of things the agency already knew could happen. There is no line on it for an animal that should not exist. So the honest report arrives at the desk of a supervisor as an unsolvable object. It cannot be closed as written, and an open report is a mark against the unit, a loose end in the monthly numbers, a question someone higher up will eventually ask about. The supervisor is not a villain. The supervisor is a person with 60 other files and a deadline. So the supervisor does the one thing the system actually permits, which is to assign the nearest box. Large animal, after dark, officer startled. Black bear, nuisance wildlife. Close the file, the problem is solved. And notice what has happened. Nothing was deleted. No one lied. The narrative is still there. But the report has now been made unfindable because from this point on, the only thing anyone will ever search, sort, or count is the category, and the category says bear. Now multiply that by 2 decades and 20 states and stack one more thing on top of it, the thing Roy himself had been hired to do. When all that old data gets migrated into a new system, the records have to be mapped, and any report whose old classification does not cleanly fit the new standard gets swept, automatically or by a contractor on a deadline, into the closest match the new system will accept. Another pass of the same logic, applied now by software at scale with no human reading a word of it. Each individual step in this entire chain is reasonable. Each step is performed by a decent person doing their job, or by a machine doing what it was told. And the sum of all those reasonable steps is a phenomenon that has been physically documented hundreds of times by the most credible witnesses you could ask for. And that is, as far as the searchable record of the United States government is concerned, completely invisible. There is no conspiracy. There has never needed to be one. The filing system is the cover-up, and the filing system does not know it. And that is so much worse because you cannot expose a thing that nobody is doing on purpose. Roy did try. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to hear this story as the story of a man who stayed quiet, and that is not quite fair to him. Near the end of the migration project, Roy took what he had found to a supervisor. He did not lead with the creature. He is too smart for that. He led with the records problem, the integrity problem, which was, after all, exactly what he had been hired to care about. He said, in effect, that he had found a category of incident, recurring across the region for 20 years, that was being systematically misclassified, and that the misclassification was hiding a real and consistent pattern, and that someone ought to look at it properly. He had the file numbers ready. He had it organized the way 30 years of training had taught him to organize a case. He told me the meeting lasted about 10 minutes and that he understood how it was going to go inside the first 2. The supervisor was not hostile. The supervisor was something worse than hostile. The supervisor was kind. He heard Roy out, and he did not argue with the file numbers, and then he gently moved the conversation somewhere else. And the somewhere else was, in so many words, that Roy was a respected officer with an excellent record and only a year or 2 left before a full retirement, and that this was an interesting curiosity but not a productive place for a man in his position to spend that last year or 2. Nothing was threatened. Nothing had to be. Roy had spent his whole career inside institutions. He could read the room. The message was received, and the message was that the door he was knocking on did not open, had never opened, and that continuing to knock on it would only damage the hand doing the knocking. He thanked the man and he went back to his desk and he finished the migration and he did not raise it again. This is the part of the story where I have to talk about what all of this did to Roy himself, because he was very clear with me that the encounter on the road, as frightening as it was, is not the wound he is still carrying. The wound is everything that came after, and most of it has nothing to do with the creature at all. Think about who this man was. Roy's entire sense of himself was built on two foundations. The first was competence in the woods. He was the man who knew the forest, who could not get lost in it, who could read it and move through it in the dark and be at home there when other men were afraid. The second was that he was a reliable witness. His professional life, his good name, the trust his colleagues placed in his reports, all of it rested on the simple fact that when Roy told you what he had seen, you could take it to the bank. The night on that road took a hammer to the first foundation. The 13 years in the records took a hammer to the second. Because here was a man whose word had always been good, who had now seen with his own trained eyes something real, and who had then watched his own truthful account of it get quietly relabeled into a lie by the very institution that had taught him to value the truth. And he had learned that the only safe thing to do with the most important thing he had ever witnessed was to never, ever say it out loud. So he did not say it out loud. Not for years. Not even at home. And that is where the real, lasting damage in this story was done. Not on the road, but in his own house. Roy did not tell Nancy. Understand what that means. He had been married to this woman for the better part of his adult life. They had built everything together. And he came home from a shift one October morning carrying the single largest and most disorienting experience of his life. And he could not find a way to set it down in front of her. Because the only way to say it was to say a sentence that sounded out loud in a kitchen like the first sign of a man coming apart. He was afraid, this competent and careful man, that his own wife would look at him differently. So he said nothing, and the nothing did exactly what carried secrets always do. It put a pane of glass between them. Nancy knew, the way a person always knows. She knew the precise night near enough that something in her husband had changed. She watched him stop sleeping properly. She watched him start checking the doors. She watched the man she had married, who had always been so easy in the woods, become a man who did not want to walk out to the truck after dark and who could not or would not tell her why. She told me when she finally and briefly agreed to speak to me that the not knowing went on for years, and that the not knowing was its own particular kind of lonely, the kind where you are lying right next to the person and the distance is still total. And it cost him the woods. That is the loss that I think will land hardest with those of you who have built your own lives around the outdoors, because you will understand it without my explaining it. Roy stopped hunting. A man who had hunted that country every single fall since he was a boy, who had organized his whole year around the season, simply stopped. The fall after the encounter, he let it pass. And the next one, he never bought another license. His hunting partners, men he had shared deer camp with for decades, asked him about it the way men do, and Roy gave them his knees, gave them work, gave them anything but the truth, and after a while they stopped asking, and a friendship that had been built entirely on going into the woods together quietly went hollow. Because the woods were the one place Roy could no longer follow them. Picture that clearly. A man stripped of the exact thing that had made him himself. Not by a court, not by an injury, not by anything anyone could see or name, but by a private knowledge he was not allowed to share. The forest had been Roy's home for 50 years, and it became a place he drove the long way around. The loneliest part of it, he told me, was never the fear. It was being the only one. He would lie awake and he would think about the fact that the truth was not even hidden. It was right there. It was sitting in a government database, hundreds of honest accounts, his own among them. Perfectly preserved, perfectly readable, and perfectly buried, and the only thing standing between that truth and the daylight was a column of category codes that no one would ever think to doubt. He had the evidence. He had more evidence than any researcher in the field had ever assembled, and having it changed nothing, because evidence that cannot be found is the same in every way that matters as evidence that does not exist. It was that loneliness, finally, that sent him looking for one other person. Roy is not a man of the internet, but he had file numbers and he had names, the names of the officers who had written the reports in his stack, and he was still, after everything, an investigator. So he reached out, quietly, carefully, one at a time, to a few of the people whose accounts had unsettled him most. Most did not answer, or did not want to talk, which Roy understood completely because their silence was built out of the same calculation as his own. But one did. We will call him Stan. Stan was a retired officer from another of the 9 states, a man who had spent his own long career on national forest land far from Pennsylvania, and who had written, years before Roy ever found it, a report describing an upright canine animal. The two of them, 2 old officers who had never met, talked on the telephone for a long time. Stan's account, given to me later in his own words, is worth hearing because of how it ended. He had filed his report honestly, the way Roy had. He had watched it come back recoded the way Roy's had. And when I asked Stan why in all the years since he had never pushed it, never gone public, never forced anyone to look, his answer was not about fear of ridicule, and it was not about his pension. He said that the longer he had sat with it, the more he had come to feel that the animal had earned a kind of silence from him. He said it could have hurt him out there the night he saw it, and that it had pointedly and deliberately chosen not to, and that telling the world where it lived would be a poor way to answer that. 2 officers, 2 states who never knew each other, who had each independently decided that the most decent thing they could do with the most important thing they had ever seen was to leave it be. That is not how men talk about a bear. Because the longer Roy studied his own stack of files, the clearer one thing in them became. And it is the thing I most want you to carry away from this. The animal in those 200 reports is not described as a monster. Read across all of them the way Roy did, and a pattern of behavior rises out of the pages that is far stranger and far more unsettling than simple aggression would ever be. It is the behavior of something that is managing us. Look at what it actually does in those accounts. It appears again and again near the edges of human activity, near roads, near gates, near work sites, near the places where the forest and our machinery meet. It paces vehicles and then breaks off. It stands over a kill in plain sight, as if the kill is a statement and not a meal. It holds a road, the way it held Roy, and then it clears that road and lets the human go. Across 200 reports written by people who had never spoken to one another, the through line is not attack. The through line is restraint. This is an animal in a forest full of armed hunters that has the size and the speed and the strength to do real harm, and that, with a consistency no ordinary predator displays, chooses the warning over the wound. It tells you to leave. It makes very sure you understand that it could enforce that, and then it lets you leave. And an animal that can make that choice over and over for 2 decades across 9 states is an animal that understands the difference between a threat and a killing, and understands what a killing would bring down on it. It knows that a dead hunter brings searchers and dogs and helicopters and the press and 100 men with rifles. And a frightened officer who drives away and files a report that gets stamped black bear brings nothing at all. It has, in other words, taken our own filing system into account. It has learned that our paperwork will protect it, and it is right. There is one file in Roy's stack that he saved for last when he was telling me all of this, and I am going to give it to you the way he gave it to me, because it is the one that changed how he understood the entire pattern. It was one of the most recent reports in the whole collection, from 2019, and it was not an officer's sighting at all. It was a search and rescue file. An older man, an experienced hunter, had become separated from his party in heavy national forest country late in the season, in falling temperatures after dark. He spent a night out, by every reasonable expectation that should have been a body recovery because a night out in those conditions kills people. But near first light he walked out on his own 2 feet and reached a road and was found cold and exhausted but alive. And in the narrative field of that search and rescue file recorded plainly by whoever took his statement and then closed under a routine category and never read again, was what the old hunter said had happened to him in the night. He said that something large had come and stayed with him. He said it never let him see it clearly and never came close enough to touch and never made a sound he could pin down. But that it was there, at the edge of things all night, pacing him through the dark. And he said that every time he started to drift in a direction he should not go, every time he turned toward the deeper timber and the cold, the thing would be there ahead of him, a shape and a pressure in the dark, turning him. He said it walked him out. He said it kept him moving and it kept him pointed at the road until the road was under his feet and then it was gone. Roy read that file at his desk, a federal officer at the end of a long career, and he thought about the thing that had stopped him on a gravel road 15 years before. The thing whose attention had nearly stopped his heart, and he understood that he had been measured that night, the same way the lost hunter had been measured and that both of them had been let go. So we are left, as we always are with this, holding a thing that has no clean place to be set down. Roy has thought about little else for years, and he has not found the bottom of it. And I do not think there is a bottom to find. Suppose the records were forced into the light tomorrow. Suppose the categories were corrected and the 200 narratives were read into the daylight and the 9-state pattern was admitted out loud. What follows is not vindication. What follows is the forest filling up with men and lights and rifles and cameras with people who want to be the one who proves it or the one who kills it, and an animal that has survived for as long as it has by being unfindable would be hunted across the last ground it has. And suppose instead the records stay exactly as they are, stamped bare, stamped undetermined, stamped unfounded. Then the silence holds and the forest stays quiet and the animal is left in peace. And the price of that peace is paid by the next hunter, the next hiker, the next young officer on a night shift, who walks into that country knowing nothing because the record that could have told them something was filed where no one will ever look. Roy could not find his way to a clean answer between those two, and neither can I. The honest thing, the only honest thing, is to say that the difficulty is real and to refuse to pretend it away. There is a smaller, more personal thread I have to close before I close the whole thing, and it goes back to Merle, the old officer who trained Roy at the very start. You remember the sentence Merle said on a dark grade above the Tianesta country, the warning Roy mistook for advice about staying awake. Somewhere in the middle of his months of reading, Roy went looking, and he found, in the files of his own forest, from years before his own encounter, an incident report written in a hand he recognized. It was Merle's, and it described in Merle's own flat, careful language an upright animal on a forest road at night. It had come back to Merle recoded, the same as Roy's would be, the same as all of them were. Merle had carried it his whole career and said nothing. And then, on one dark night near the end, he had not quite been able to say nothing to the young officer he was training. And so he had pressed the truth down into a single sentence small enough to be safe, and handed it across the cab, and hoped. Roy had been carrying a warning for 30 years without knowing it was a warning. And the discovery told him something final and bleak about the machine he had uncovered. It does not run for 20 years. It runs for as long as there have been officers and forms. It is generational. Merle's truth was buried and Roy's truth was buried, and somewhere in that 9-state stack is a 2019 report, a young officer's careful account, freshly stamped with the wrong category. The newest layer of the same silence, already settling into place. Roy is retired now, He is in his late 50s and he still lives where he has always lived. Within sight on a clear day of the high ground of the forest he gave his working life to. He told me he does not go deep into it anymore. He will drive the paved roads. He will go to the overlooks. But he does not walk the back country, and he does not go in after dark, and the man who once knew that forest better than he knew anything has made a kind of peace with loving it from the edge. He got some of his marriage back. After he retired with the pension finally secure and the job no longer able to punish him for honesty, Roy finally sat down with Nancy and told her the whole of it, the road and the records and the 13 years of silence. He told me she was quiet for a long while, and then she said that she only wished he had not carried it alone, that she could have carried it with him the entire time, and that the wall between them had never needed to be there. The fear had built that wall, the fear and the certainty the institution had taught him that the truth was the one thing he could not afford to say. I want to leave you with where the evidence actually sits tonight because it is not in a vault and it is not destroyed and it is not lost. It is exactly where it has always been. 200 and more honest incident reports written by federal officers and biologists and rangers across 9 states over 20 years are sitting right now in a United States government database. Every narrative is intact. Every word those witnesses wrote is preserved, complete and readable. The information has not been hidden. It has only been mislabeled. It is filed under bear and under coyote and under vandalism and under unfounded and under undetermined, and the labels are the only thing anyone will ever read. And so the truth sits there in plain sight, perfectly safe and perfectly silent, the way a thing can be hidden best by not hiding it at all. So the next time you are out past the pavement, on a forest road after dark, anywhere in that long stretch of northern timber from the Allegheny to the Great Lakes, I would ask you only to remember this. The quiet of those woods is not the same as emptiness. The official record of a place and the truth of a place are 2 different things, and they have been 2 different things on that ground for a very long time, since 1794. Since before there was a form to file. Something in that forest has learned how our paperwork works and has learned that it has nothing to fear from it, and is out there tonight walking a road it considers its own, watching headlights come around the bend and deciding, the way it decided about Roy, and the way it decided about a lost old hunter in the cold, whether the thing in the truck needs to be warned or measured or simply let go. The forest keeps its own records. It always has. And ours for now are filed under bear.